So becoming a pro at this. Okay, I think we're recording. So, all right, I'm gonna share my screen if you will bear with me. Okay. And okay. So my goal today is I am not coming with any profound solutions. I am not coming to tell you what to do. I am merely here with Chelsea and Carrie's support to start a conversation, to help you all to maybe begin to think of the things you do personally as a church, as ministries of the congregation, to think of ministry in perhaps some different ways. And so just to get us started, what I'd like to do is ask you all to offer up what are some of the words when you think about mission or ministry, what are some of the words that come to mind?
Now, sharing the love of Jesus with your fellow man.
Mm-hmm. Sharing love, Jesus, fellow man. Those are all great words.
Well, our church always uses the mindset of making a loving difference. And so that to me is our church mission in all things.
Mm. Yeah, I always love that mission statement. Every time I come and see your banner there in the sanctuary. Yeah. What other words come to mind?
Sharing our gifts.
Gifts. Yeah. What is it? Go ahead, Steve.
Compassion, maybe.
Compassion's a really powerful word. When you think of, like being the church, are there words that come to mind?
I guess the biggest one is just love in general, loving others and caring for them.
Mm-hmm. Caring for, yeah. Any others?
Oh, definitely service.
Service. Okay.
And walking in a Christ-like manner.
Walking Christ-like.
All very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in many ways. Sure.
Evangelizing through deeds.
That's really, really beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say putting a face on God's love. Putting a face on that. That is
face on God's love. Yeah. So let me read back to you some of the things that I heard. Said sharing, love, Jesus, fellow man, making a loving difference, gifts, compassion, caring for, service, walking, Christ-like, evangelizing through deeds, putting a face on God's love. So those are some of the things that kind of bubble up, and I think if you reflect personally and even as a church, I think what you'll find is those are some of the things that really, really drive you, and even when it's hard, continue to compel you to show up. And so what I want to do is offer a little bit of a broader perspective about what that might look like in kind of a practical sense. What oftentimes happens when we think of mission or ministry is we tend to homogenize it into it's just one thing, when really, based on our gifts, and if you even look across your own congregation, I think you'll see that people express based on their gifts themselves in mission and ministry in a lot of different ways. And so you've all probably heard I think it's a Chinese proverb, it is not in the Bible, I'll clarify, of if you give a man a fish, he'll fish for a day. If you teach a man a fish, he will fish for a lifetime. And in more of the secular world, even mission perhaps even singles down to, well, we give people fish and we teach people to fish. So I want to offer you a few more words to the words you've already named to think through this. So giving a fish, oftentimes that's when we give food, we give socks, we give things to people in need. So words that are often associated with that kind of mission and ministry are charity, relief, transaction. They're the things we do that alleviate suffering. If we think of teaching people to fish, that kind of kicks it up a notch. Those are the kinds of things like where we might say, create a tutoring program for kids after school, or I like to think a lot of times of our housing ministry and our employment ministry as kind of teaching people to be able to get money to go get their own fish, essentially. So words that are associated with that kind of mission and ministry are recovery, empowerment, relationship. It's more of your community and personal development kind of expression. And so there's also a man named John Perkins who is big in the Christian community development world, who says there's actually a third spoke to that understanding of the pond analogy. And he says that there's also the question of who owns the pond. And so what I offer to you is a consideration that it is also mission and ministry to consider justice, policy, change, as words we associate with mission and ministry. And what John Perkins really profoundly unpacks, if you ever read some of his stuff, is he asks questions like, okay, we can give fish all day long, we can teach people to fish, but what happens if the pond is polluted? What happens if there's a wall around the pond that limits who gets to fish because of a particular characteristic, which there's no access? What if your pond happens to be located in a poor zip code? What if the fishing manual is outdated? So what he challenges us to think when we consider mission and ministry is that there are things that transcend the simplicity of both giving and teaching people to fish. And what I want to offer you for consideration as we think about ministry with people is a fourth way of looking at ministry and mission. And that's recognizing that perhaps in the work we do, the pond itself is not always enough. What if the pond moves? What if, and that could be equated to like a big business or a job moving out of a community and leaving people in need? What if gangs are fighting over the pond? What if the pond is just simply not safe? What if the person that we're teaching to fish just isn't a good fisherman, and fish is just not going to be what's going to ultimately sustain them? You can equate that to chronically ill or mentally ill folks, or those that have addiction? You know, what if just fishing in general is challenging to people? What if the person is imprisoned, and what if they're imprisoned for fishing illegally and permanently denied a fishing permit to be able to? So the fourth aspect of this is recognizing that there are things that transcend the things that we traditionally think of mission and ministry, that cannot be easily defined as simply transaction, simply relationship, or simply just going upstream and changing the policies and things that have made the pond what it is. In that fourth piece, you might use words like bridging gaps, removing barriers, equal partnership. It's really the accompaniment piece, going with people and journeying with our neighbors in ways that aren't necessarily natural expressions of what we, it's wrestling with the hard problems, and being able to go with people when you don't have any solutions and come up with solutions together. So what we learn from these words is that there's really no right or wrong way to do mission or do ministry. But as there is a unique call in church mission, it just looks a little different than you might find in other contexts. Church mission and ministry, unlike more of a secular context of mission, embodies and always will embody a look at the whole person, a holistic and interconnected understanding of how we exist within a community. Another way of looking at it is when you try to measure giving, teaching, and advocating, for instance, you might measure giving fish by measuring the number of meals provided. You might measure teaching in the percent of lives changed and a more percentage outcome. You might measure advocacy in tracking policy changes and the things that, the wins that come from your advocacy. But what's really unique about that fourth piece, that ministry with piece, is that we're not necessarily going to measure it the ways that we measured the other three. Ministry with is actually better associated with story, relationship, experiences. The kinds of questions you might ask in reflecting on, was that expression of ministry and mission successful, are, you know, what are the things that are breaking God's heart? How did we lean into that? How is God already working in this community, in this neighborhood, in this population that we're feeling called to? It's a fundamental recognition. God is already at work in the lives of the people and the situations we find ourselves. How did we join God? That's the kind of question that ministry with begins to answer. Ministry with, to put it in more practical terms, it means that we recognize that God is already stirring in the lives of our neighbors before we even showed up. And our neighbors actually have just as much to offer to us, and quite possibly more because of their experiences in bringing about the solutions as we do. We, in trying to do ministry with, ultimately find that we need each other in different ways than we might have shown up in the past in order to bring about the kingdom. The hard part is that it often feels unnatural to trade our place of having solutions, to trade our place of being the giver, which in some ways is a position of power. What's unnatural is trading that place of power for a place of humility, to show up alongside people who seemingly have nothing to give, and fundamentally recognize that if we're going to do with, we recognize that they have something to offer as well. And a quote I really like that I think sums up kind of where the end goal, what the end goal looks like when we're doing ministry with, is from a guy named Walter Wink. Has written a number of different books about doing ministry with. And he says what Jesus envisioned was a world transformed. And transformation essentially means where both people and powers are in harmony with the ultimate and committed to the general welfare, what some prefer to call the kingdom of God. It's this place of equality that we're seeking. And so to unpack that for you a little bit more, I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean when I'm talking about joining God or joining neighbor. And what's interesting, if you look at these two comparisons, they actually look somewhat similar. Joining God and joining neighbor are not that far apart. So when we look to join God, for instance, you're going to not necessarily show up saying, I know what the problem is, I know how to bring about the solution. You're going to start with a sense of wonder and acknowledge that every person you meet and those you come into interaction with has equally much wisdom to offer. And when we listen to that and trust how the Spirit is moving through that relationship, we can then begin to experiment based on our learnings and reflect and invite others into that. Many times when people approach ministry and mission with a mindset of what does it mean to join God in what God is already doing, a common exercise is to take time to walk around a neighborhood, and a neighborhood could be a community. It could be what's happening at your food pantry. It could be what's happening at a community dinner. It could be whatever you define as the community that has called upon your heart to learn more about. A common thing that people do is they will spend time walking around the neighborhood and truly listening to what the people are saying. Asking those questions I referenced prior. What are we grateful for in this space? What is breaking God's heart? What do you see that you didn't see before? What might be an unspoken strength of the community and the people that you're meeting, or the unacknowledged need that might be something worth wrestling with and inviting neighbors to be a part of. And that's more of an organizational way of approaching joining God if we're trying to figure out where does God want us to show up. When it comes to an individual, sometimes it's just spending enough time with that neighbor to learn what they have to offer. Some of the things we've learned in spending time with individuals in our street community is there's a woman named Anne who makes beautiful jewelry, but she doesn't have the means the technology to market it. So that's a way we see how God is working in her. We recognize that there's people in our churches that do have that means. How do we make those connections and help Anne to be able to be the best Anne that she can be? There's another woman named Debbie who likes to make jam, but she oftentimes doesn't have blackberries or a kitchen in which to make it. So you see how when we spend time with people and we truly understand the unique ways and gifts God has given to them, we then have a new appreciation for the resources and the means that we actually bring to the table. And as I said, reflecting on joining neighbor looks very similar. It means creating spaces. You all, through your pantry, your community meals, the work you're already doing, if you reflect on those things, you probably already have spaces where you are creating space for people to come, to connect, and God is speaking into those spaces. The challenge is to not leave it at the space and to say, how do we observe where God is speaking? What is the wisdom we are learning from the people who are coming and gathered in those ways? How do we recognize those gifts and design solutions together with this community? And how might we encourage neighbors to lead us in some of those solutions so that we can go on a mission together? More practical examples are many times, and I think you all are a good example of this. When we had the community meals, we in the churches, we recognized transportation was something that needed to happen in order to get to Christ Lutheran more easily. And one of our neighbors offered to drive the bus to get people to the Christ Lutheran dinner and led us in that way. It's seeing a need and looking to the values in the community to be able to make those things happen. As well as when you bring it down to an individual level, recognizing, the story I like to tell is, the man, not just stopping at, the man who's grumpy coming to our community dinner, wondering, what is it that's making him grumpy? And the story that I think of, and that is one of the things we learn, is when a volunteer spent time with him, is that he was having a problem with his teeth and he needed his teeth fixed. And that was ultimately what was making him grumpy, which then led to trying to find other connections in the community for how we could more easily access dental care for people like him and others.
Megan,
Yes.
I sat down with people during the community meal. I, for the most part, I find that they don't really want to spend time talking about their lives
Mm-hmm.
because I guess maybe they feel the way they are and the way we are, coming from two different sort of worlds, that we can't appreciate their situations.
Yeah. So, thank you for that, Steve. So one of the next things I was going to share is that in the time I spent talking to a number of you, trying to decide how to begin this conversation with Christ Lutheran, one of the things I found was that many of the folks from Christ Lutheran would say, of course I want to be welcoming. But I don't know what to say to form a relationship with our neighbors. I don't want to offend. I don't want to become their counselor. What if they ask me for money? So there's that narrative. But what we have the privilege of also knowing is the contrasting narrative of our neighbors is I want to be welcomed, but I could never be welcomed in NEMA context. I don't dress the part. I don't look the part. I don't smell the part. I'm not worthy of that relationship or being in that space. So your naming, Steve, that is a part of the gentle balance we're wrestling with in this conversation, is how do we get folks from the churches to a place where they can show up in those conversations in a way that encourages our neighbors, because they need encouragement. And how do we lift up and empower our neighbors to know that we want them to feel fundamentally welcome and empowered to be a part of that? So therein lies the struggle. And it comes down to a passage I think we all know well. And that's that if we join God and we join neighbor in what neighbor and God both have to offer in a situation, we are leaning into Matthew 22, which talks about the greatest commandment being love God and love your neighbor. And that is kind of the essence of what we are talking about. So there's a small enough group, so we're not going to go into breakout sessions, but I'm curious to pause and ask you all to share a little bit about what, as you reflect on some of the things I'm sharing, what occurs to you about the ways that Christ Lutheran or yourself are showing up in giving fish, teaching fish to fish, advocating for the pond, or going beyond that? How does that resonate with you?
Well, Meghann, one of the things that I had mentioned previously, you said you have a Sunday service for your clients, and unfortunately, it's probably at the very same time that we have ours.
Mm-hmm.
So it was sometime a little bit different, or if I could break away from that, having to go to my service, I would like to spend some time with your community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have to say, I feel like as a social ministry person, that's leading the programs that we're doing, I feel as though we are in the charity phase of we're always handing out stuff. And I think there's so many active members that are willing to do more. It's how to get to that teaching relational kind of ministry that is a big step to take.
Yeah.
Big change and paradigm for everyone. And it's certainly not as easy, because there's, to me, a tremendous more commitment in the interpersonal relationships that are required to do that kind of teaching ministry.
Yeah.
And I see opportunities, but it's, all of our membership is much older, and now during the pandemic, that in and of itself is a challenge, because it does, I think, would require a lot more interpersonal connections. And this time frame is, I think, a wonderful time for us to figure out how to take that big step. We've asked in the past if we could get some volunteers to help moving and helping, like your ministry, for the furniture and collections, and it just is so much harder because there's only so much brawn that we have currently in our church that isn't working during the week, and so many of these ministries are weekday kind of things. So I'm interested in seeing if you guys have ideas, to be honest with you, because I would like to get beyond charity if at all possible, because I don't see how long term we're doing anything but just helping that one day at a time kind of thing, which is important, but I'd like to eventually be able to move beyond that.
Yeah, I want to affirm, I think you're naming a really important thing, and that's all the more reason why we're not just showing up and saying, just do this, because it is a challenge. It is a commitment to say, we're going to really take some time to understand this and understand what it means to do that, and wrestle with what it looks like to transform ourselves and our community in that particular way. Something that I really liked that was shared at the previous session was a recognition as that those stages of the pond, if you look at them as stages, are kind of a growth process. They are, many times we do show up as the church with the what can we give you? What can we do to or for you? And reframing that and reshaping it is a matter of slowly but surely beginning to say, well, we know that, well, let's ask the community first what they need. And when we learn that, then we get to decide, or we discern kind of how do we lean into that. And they may not, there's an example that I like out of Austin, Texas, about a food truck ministry that was formed 20 plus years ago. And this group of church guys got together, and they had all these ideas about all the things they were going to put on this food truck, and phone cards and this, that, and the other. And they had a member of their original team who was homeless. And they said, why don't you include socks? And it totally changed the conversation, because the privileged group of folks designing and providing the food truck did not know that socks would be something that would be needed by people who are homeless. And so starting with creating that space, asking, I can't necessarily tell you what it is to do other than to find ways to create spaces with people who you want to be in relationship with, listening, and then beginning to try to figure out how God is already working and how the church or yourselves may show up to accompany God in what God is already doing.
Meghann, would you consider our boot ministry part of the pond?
Yeah. I mean, that's the boot ministry is very much a part of the pond. Fundamentally, it is something where you recognize there is a need and you all are responding to it. I guess one way you might think about that differently is what would it look like for if that is a named need. Maybe we shouldn't be in the middle of giving those boots out. Maybe those boots should be given out by members of your church directly to the people that need them, as a way of forming relationship and starting conversation. So it's all a matter in how you look at it.
Meghann, this is Carrie, and what this kind of pulls up for me is some of the lessons that I experienced at the table at St. George's when we were doing feed me ministry. And I was at the same time I was working in Africa, and I had some international development people say to me, we teach people to fish. We don't give them the fish. And we had a really interesting conversation around that when I got back, because many of our people coming to our food pantries, they are fishing 2 and 3 jobs. They're fishing a lot, and they can't grow food year round in the way some parts of the world. So some of the things that these people were saying, well, this is what we would do. don't work in our context. And in fact, showing up and being there with food is the doorway to the relationship, right? And it's the doorway to that next conversation. And when we started saying to people coming to the table, what else are you feeling a need for, and got into a relationship, they wanted to volunteer. They wanted a place to give back. And so we were able to say, do you have an hour? Do you have half an hour? We were able to start breaking things into small ways and saying, just, if you can make it that day, come and scoop rice. So that's just one example, but it was a real teaching to me of how the transaction is important, and it is meeting a need. There is somebody who's disabled who is showing up at your food pantry who is incredibly grateful for what you are giving them that day and has no other way to get it. But what they might have is a great smile, and they might be a greeter for you, or they might be somebody who could, they have a gift. Everybody's got a gift that they're bringing into this space. So I just encourage us to remember that they are stages, but they're not mutually exclusive. I don't think we have to see one as less than another. I think they can invite us into new ways of being together.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the things, when you reflect on some of the things that you personally are involved in or the church is involved in, what are some of the things you think are currently or could get in the way of moving in a direction where you might look at the pond more holistically?
I think personally with myself, it's sometimes fear of prying too much, fear that the people are feeling as though I may be in some form of judgment, and that it's just it can be an awkward conversation when you're handing something to someone, then asking them a question that they think I'm in some way either going to try to either preach to them or teach to them. And it's finding that balance that I find I'm fearful of. And anybody that I've talked to would much rather serve the food than go around and necessarily feel like they have to sit down because I don't know, it's challenging. And so until you can get those relationships really going, and I know that there's some really social people in our church that really do a great job of sitting and talking. It's how to transition it into more than that I find a struggle for myself. Yeah. And so I'm always looking for, well, tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Yeah.
And in that way, I always like to get ideas from other people's successes. So whenever we have the MICA meetings, it's interesting to hear better ways another church might do something, and reading the articles about the table in the newspaper gets you excited about, well, maybe we can change things over time once the pandemic is over.
Yeah, and to some extent, what I feel like I hear in what you're saying, Kathy, is to some extent you all may need someone to accompany you into some of those hard conversations to model, like, what does that look like? How does that go? And be able to kind of see it enough that you all can embody and embrace that, moving forward over time. So.
Meghann, I think another thing is that, at least I learned from the community meals, is a lot of people are not willing to share maybe what they feel their needs are because they've been disappointed when they have shared them. They've been let down.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, and just to speak a little bit as somebody who, Kathy, I can really relate to what you're saying in terms of there's a fear factor of prying too much or saying things. I when I started this work, I was the outsider kind of coming in, and to be really honest, like, I have Meghann, pointing to her because she's my box to my left. I had Meghann, who had been obviously the director and here for 12 years, Carrie, who had been a formative part of this work. And then here comes this 30-year-old person who is an outsider and kind of like immersed in these spaces, and there was a trust factor. So I think you're right when you can name that when you're in these meals, you know, you're not just going to walk in and like kind of what Steve's naming, you're not going to walk in and say, so tell me about your like latest trauma that you had in your life and talk about, that's not going to happen. It starts with showing up. It starts with being consistent and finding spaces where there are, and that's hard in a cyclical type church work. I get that. And so what I think could be helpful as we're navigating through this conversation, and what I think is going to be really interesting about these cohorts, which Megan's going to bring up in a little bit, is that we could have an opportunity to present spaces, safe spaces, where people could be welcomed in and people could have their story heard. And that could be a good first place to start in safe, like with our street church community. You know, we have created a safe and sacred space where people can share. But that's not just, you know, you want to come in and you want to have safe spaces where people know like that this is a respected space, that they can be heard, that it's confidential. You know what I mean? So we need to find spaces where that can happen, where those walls can come down, but it's not going to come down right away. It is going to take time. It is going to take consistency. So I think it's really important to name that there is a process that happens for that, but it takes the church showing up and being consistent.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm jealous of people with those special gifts and those abilities to just kind of transform things. So an example is Rick Townsend. He's no longer at our church, but he started the bike ministry. Not Rick. No, that was Chamberlain. I'm sorry. And the fact that he was able to just kind of transfer his wonderful gift into something meaningful for other people. And I'm like, I'm still searching for what my gift is. We have quilters that translate their gifts into doing more hands-on, you know, blankets and making those face masks and all that kind of stuff. And I think some of us and many of us are still searching for our special gifts of how to translate that into something that whether we're going to start teaching people. I mean, I think at our church, I wonder, and I can't speak on behalf of the quilters, but I'm wondering if the skills of knowing how to sew could be translated to others, so that could be meaningful.
And that's exactly the kind of ways that we all have to begin to think differently about what we do in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve. And there's no easy answers to it, but that's a part of what we are inviting you all to go on this journey and go with you as you and the church are thinking through this. So Diane, is there anything you want to say before I move on? You're so quiet. I don't want to leave you out.
No, I just wanted to make sure that I got to see your faces and get to know you, and that you know where I am in the branches of our social ministry. And because I'm certain that I'll have questions for Meghann or maybe one of the other lovely ladies here. And then at least we'll have a face contact. And you'll know who I am, and I'll know who you are. And I appreciate that.
Sure.
And Diane won't tell you this, but basically she's hands-on in multiple ministries, whether it's the WITS program at our church or, and she's in charge of that as well. Right. And also very involved with the community meal now that we're delivering, and even when we were serving. So, I think that both, all the members of our church wear many hats at times.
Yeah. So I want to take this to offer a little bit of a more theological perspective on the pond. And to do that, I want to use the story of Moses to reflect on kind of a different way of maybe thinking about what we've been talking about. So when you think of, many of us, we know the story of Moses is a common story that most people know pretty well. And, you know, this certainly doesn't lay out the whole story, but these are some key parts of the story. You know, Moses's life, you know, began and was saved ultimately because two midwives recognized their gift to send Moses up the Nile River, where he was ultimately rescued and raised in Pharaoh's palace. Moses, as an adult, took an act of justice to when he saw an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew slave. He actually killed the Egyptian, which ultimately sent him, that act of justice sent him fleeing to the wilderness, where of course he met God, and God called him back to some new activities of that you might actually see as teaching, to go back and not only teach and gain the trust of the Hebrew people to follow him out of Egypt, but to also teach Pharaoh that there were some bigger things that needed to be paid attention to in order to free the people. And there were 10 plagues, of course, that ultimately landed Moses and the Hebrew people in the wilderness for quite a long time. And so as we're reflecting on this idea of giving people fish, teaching people to fish, advocating for people to be able to fish, to access the pond, and even looking beyond the pond, I think this story is really helpful in understanding there is this whole realm of freedom from captivity work that the church is really good at hanging out in, whether it's rescuing people from this disaster or desperation, whether it's advocating, whether it's helping teach people how to kind of exist beyond that. But what I believe, there are plenty of organizations and people who do those things very secularly. But what I have come to believe is that, and why I think the Moses story is so powerful, and how it helps us think about the bigger picture and how the church uniquely shows up in this, is that any secular expression of mission that gives people fish, teaches people fish, advocates for people to have access to the pond, when they're housed, when they're employed, when they're fed, they are not going to recognize that there is a whole wilderness beyond the solution. And that is something unique that the church brings to this story. That is, in my opinion, the fundamental question we are asking when we ask ourselves about what it means to do ministry with people. What we are asking is, what does it mean to hang out with people in the wilderness, to set up a tent where we both encounter God and we both are fundamentally changed by that connection and that shared experience in trying to journey together to what we know as the promised land. So just a theological perspective on what exactly we may be doing, wondering about what it means to be in the wilderness.
Meghann, just a general question.
Yeah.
Before all this COVID started, and I know you housed, your object was to house as many people as possible. How many of those people, to your knowledge, have started attending A church?
Well, so interestingly, I mean, the work that Chelsea and Carrie have done around street church has, we have generally had 20 to 30 people every Sunday. I mean, have folks that we have just decided to go be a part of kind of any other church. I think that kind of transcends the question, but street church has become a safe place for them to connect.
Yeah, that's why I guess that's why I'm asking the question is, you know, once they're housed and they're fed and they're working, do they feel that they're less of a part of the regular situation in life, or that they just feel safer going to the micro service?
That is a fundamental and powerful question. I do think it's fair to say that the best participation we get at street church is mainly people who are either in our hotel shelter or they are in stable housing, which I think speaks to it's hard to really hang out in the wilderness and think about bigger picture things until people truly settle.
Mhm.
Until people don't have to be so focused on where they're going to get their fish, how they're going to survive. I think there's a truth to that.
I think there's also something that needs to be said about the work that we need to do to prepare our churches for receipt of our people, and I say that because there is a desire to maybe go into our churches. I've had one person in particular has asked me multiple times about coming to a church, and he's come to Micah Street Church and he feels perfectly comfortable there. But he says, but you know, I might want to go to another church. I'm like, that's great. But then I've had others share with me that, you know, if they have a criminal background, that their parole officers have told them that they are not to come to church, especially if they could be on the sex offender list. And so we have a space where we generally don't have children. And so that's a safe space in that way. But I think there's a need to talk about, there's this perception in themselves of that they are not welcome in these spaces because I've heard when I did my chaplaincy at the VA, people that come back from war, veterans, can sometimes feel like a wolf in the flock. They're not, but that's how they feel, and that's how they're received in a church setting. And so sometimes our people may be feeling that way, that they feel like they can't fully express themselves, or how are they seen? And so it's nothing that is to blame in the church, but we need to talk about, when we're welcoming all people, how we really do that when we may have people from all different experiences and backgrounds too, which is, I think, part of this work.
We have a couple of guys that come to our church regularly. I think Meghann, you probably know who they are, but I mean, they have a tendency sometimes to smell. They're not dressed according to, you know, shirt, tie and all the other stuff, but they're perfectly accepted at our church anyways.
Yeah. Well, and different people are, they're more oriented to that. But a lot of folks, when they're on the street, it's hard to prioritize community in the same ways that we are able to when we are in stable housing. So I want to give you just a practical example of what I'm describing through the lens of Micah. And I hear you all kind of wrestling with, okay, so if we need to move beyond charity and giving people a fish, like, what does that look like? And I think Micah's story really, really speaks to that. When we when Micah first began, we were very much about relief ministries. We were formed to help people with showers, winter shelter, food, and that was it. But it was in creating those spaces that we learned we also had to do some teaching. We also had to we got tired of seeing people get out of the hospital and not have a place to go, and said, how can we make that better? And that's what our respite shelter emerged out of. We realized people were outdoors and they couldn't afford a place on their own, even when they had income. But if you took two people who were outdoors and housed them and provided support, they could actually be successful. So as needs emerged, we created new things in response to that. And by virtue of doing those things, we've also found ourselves a number of times in managing, in advocating around trying to get local governments, the hospital, people who experience the effects of homelessness differently, to understand that it was not okay to just manage homelessness. We needed to look at what things would solve it. So we found ourselves in the advocacy realm of the pond, simply by virtue of being a part of those spaces. And often because when we did some of the things we did, people would accuse us of causing homelessness. But what has brought us to this place and this conversation is that fourth piece. It's recognizing that as much as we feed people and shower and keep them safe in the cold, and we can house people all day and help them get jobs and advocate for bigger solutions, it's been really hard to see all those things and then see people move into housing and die very quickly because they struggle in new ways. To see theoretically all the pieces get put back together, and people suffer from a deep loneliness and a deep disconnection and lack of understanding their purpose and value in the world. And that's the part that for us, we're wrestling with right now, is what you are seeing in why we have emerged as street church. It's giving people that space to wrestle with those things in probably some of the same ways that you all are a part of Christ Lutheran. It's these deep conversations with the churches to help them understand what it means to tap into that part of people's lives. And so I offer this mainly to give you hope as you look at your own congregation and some of the ways you do mission, is that your story is not all that different from Micah's story. And we are journeying with you in that, in hopes that together we can help you with things we've learned to get to a place of really leaning into that fourth space.
Meghann, one of the things that I learned from Habitat is I really love their motto. It's a hand up, not a handout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so part of the invitation to this work is we want to invite you to what we're calling neighboring cohorts, to dive deeper into some of the more specific things that we've talked about today. We imagine this as 4 sessions over 8 weeks. We'd like to begin in November. It'll approximately be every other week. What we'll do, once we kind of have an idea of how many people want to be a part of this, we'll try to find a common time. If it's enough people to do 2 groups, we'll do 2 groups or whatnot. But 4 sessions over 8 weeks, with possible outcomes being some personal reflection, from some discernment on where God is already at work in your own lives, in your church, in the communities you're already working with, a deeper understanding of our neighbors in the context of their stories, and then some practical discussion on some of the next steps for what it might look like for you and or Christ Lutheran to join God in mission and ministry moving forward. So, questions about that?
Would you desire us to, just send out an all call to all volunteers, or is Pastor Ann and Pastor Lou also inviting individuals to these sessions, or and this is just Christ Lutheran?
It
in
is.
these
This is
sessions?
just Christ Lutheran. Yeah, we are. You all are our pilot. I mean, we're hoping you all are our teachers and help us learn what we need to learn to then duplicate this process. But this is very much your conversation. And so my hope was that we would have more members of the congregation be hear this conversation, to have some initial understanding. We've recorded this so we can send this out for folks to listen to. We can even do this again if there's some additional interest. But I am interested in what you all think would be the best next step to get, some of the key people you think need to be a part of these conversations, to be part of this.
I think probably a summary of what you're really looking for, written to Ann or to Lou, that they could put in at least one issue of the hub, maybe more than one.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think most of the congregation, I guess, computers are getting the hub, and it's something at least gives them awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that there's so many people that would be enriched by this experience. And so I'll definitely want to invite others to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, just with our volunteers, there's many people, everyone has different schedules and all that kind of stuff. So time of day, everything can affect this. I know obviously Wednesdays are going to be very bad for our church because that's our day of doing the most activities and outreach. But it's finding that sweet spot of when it's going to be best and welcoming everyone to it. And I apologize for my misunderstanding of that my role in trying to invite more people to this.
Hey, yeah, I think that exactly whoever needed to show up has showed up thus far, and I think it's been nice to kind of talk to some folks we already know, and I think we're learning every time we do this. So one thought I have, and I'd be curious some feedback about this, is I could what I intend to do is to send out as a follow-up a kind of a sign-up survey of some sort where folks can say, I'd like to participate in the neighboring cohorts, and these are the times that are good for me, to try and find common times that would work. Should we send that out to the congregation with the recording of this presentation? Should we schedule another one of these presentations and work differently to invite folks to come? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that you with personally, I think the pastors send out a listing of all the opportunities each week.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Bible study and everything else. There's a lot of people that might be interested in this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's of course one of the first steps, and a clear direction of where we're heading with this. Growing as a church community and exploring new ways to spread our mission throughout the community.
Yeah.
All that. Yeah. I think there's way more than one way to invite people to be part of this. And I think me having some personal conversations with some of the social ministry leadership, but getting you their information, I'm not sure the best way. If you individually you send it out, or if we have it go through the pastors and all that stuff.
I think it probably would best come from pastors or members.
Yeah, there's so many gifts in our church that aren't necessarily just social ministry that people could give to this, whether it's our I think that there's so many different ways that's not just social ministry in my mind that, you know, whether it's the music ministry and all that kind of stuff, that there's people that probably could participate and maybe help with making the connections more more powerful in the community.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
through music and I mean, our flower ministry. There's just so many gifts that can make things beautiful for everyone.
Right.
So I think that getting a lot of the leadership involved can stem through,
Right.
of course, the pastors.
Well, and I'll circle back with Anne and kind of share this feedback and kind of devise a couple strategies to try and get. And I think if we have one session for this kind of initial 8-week round with like 6 to 8 people, I think that's beautiful. If we
Yeah.
can get, and then the goal is we do it again, and we do it as many times as we need to get people excited and thinking along the lines of where we need to go. So
Yeah, and I love your pond analogy. Whether some of us get in a boat and start paddling around, and some of us sit on the shore side.
there you
And
go.
take it in. I mean, I think that we all can glean a lot of different ways to how to look at our role in the community and Micah in general.
Yeah.
And I kind of envision us really having a very interactive and practical approach to this, where it's not just us lecturing at you. It's not just a book study. It's something where we will have like really honest conversations about how we actually kind of like, I'm still kind of struck by you saying that you haven't found your gift yet, Kathy, because I see so many amazing gifts in you and how you orchestrate and delegate people and like get things together. But I wonder how many other people are struggling with that. And we're really going to start there, of like really trying to identify people's gifts and then challenging them to get out of their comfort zones, obviously in a COVID safe way, but challenging them to get out of their comfort zones and really dream, and then come back and reflect on that. How'd that feel? What that, a really small, close-knit covenant community, which is something that comes from my tradition of just like the space where we can really talk about what it feels like, those uncomfortable moments when you're hearing someone's story or you don't know what to say, and how do I navigate that the next time, so people can really see some personal growth there. So I think it'll be a really optimal opportunity for a very small group, and then it can duplicate from there, like Meghann was saying.
Yeah, good. So, all right. Well, I wanted to, if I can, if there are there any other questions before I kind of close this out? So, what Chelsea and my contact information is here. We will follow up with you all to kind of get an idea of your availability. We hope you will decide to be part of the neighboring cohort. And like I said, I will strategize with Anne about ways to get this information out to more parts of the congregation. But I would like to, if I could, we've had some really holy conversation today. And I would like to just kind of close with a little bit of a reflection to leave you with a few more things to think about. There's a picture on the screen of some loaves and some fishes, which I think is a fundamental ministry with story, believe it or not, in the Bible, of when Jesus fed the 5,000. When you think of that story, and you think about what was actually happening in that story, I want you to consider, was Jesus giving a fish? Was he teaching people to fish? Was he advocating that everybody get fed? Or was he asking, what if? A common understanding of the fishes and loaves story is that Jesus's blessing actually multiplies the bread. It's a connection to reminding of how God provided manna for the Israelites in the wilderness. That's often how we reflect on that story. There's another perspective of that story that says this is actually a miracle of sharing. All those present, seeing Jesus bless insufficient resources, are ultimately moved to take out what they are carrying and share it with those sitting nearby. The miracle was not that Jesus multiplied the food that was available. It's that Jesus showing up in that situation and recognizing where God was at work actually allowed people to take out what they had, their gifts, the food they had brought with them, and there was enough for all. When you think of that, consider, was there a role for the hungry? If everyone took out and shared what they had, was there a role for the hungry? Jesus doesn't necessarily feed by himself in that story. There are at least 12 other volunteers, the disciples, and those who do feed are not necessarily food secure. Everybody in that story is hungry in some way, shape, or another. And the little boy who brings the offering, he doesn't really actually even understand that there's 5,000 people and all he has is a few fish and loaves. He doesn't understand that it's not enough, yet he has a curiosity and a willingness to show up, to offer what he has. And the disciples, not unlike us, participate in that story wondering, how can we ever feed this many people? The message, essentially in a miracle of sharing, is that there actually is in fact plenty, excess, when we all share our gifts, our blessings, and function at the highest levels of the unique and wonderful creations that God intended us to be. Offering what we do have is always enough when we join Jesus and God in what God is already doing, and recognize that those we aim to serve, the least, the hungry, or whatever name we might put on it, our neighbors, that those we aim to serve have equally abundant gifts to offer as well. Chelsea, will you pray for us?
I have two screens and my mouse is like floating away. Sorry. I'd be happy to. Thank you. Let us pray. Almighty God, thank you for the opportunity to reflect on the ways that you are calling us forward in our insecurities and fears, Lord. You tell us, do not be afraid. You call us to love our neighbor in a deep and intentional way. Help us, Lord. Help those who are not here in this conversation yet. Guide them towards this group. I thank you for the honesty and the vulnerability that was expressed in this call today, and help us to lean on each other so that we may better love like you. In your name we pray. Amen.